Well, there have been rumors recently about how strongly in control Xi Jinping is in China. Some people have talked about maybe he's dreaming of retirement, maybe he's going to be pushed aside. Personally, I don't see any evidence for that. And I think that it's been clear that more recently he's come out more strongly. Newspaper articles have started appearing again featuring him. And I think since the beginning, he's turned out to be a much stronger leader than everybody expected. Basically, when he took power in 2012, 2013, I think he was seen as the lowest common denominator leader. He could kind of appease to different groups within the party. And I think he's really shocked everybody by how strongly he then asserted his power. It's been quite clear that ever since he took over, he saw that there was a threat to the party and that China could only move forward if he strengthened the party, if he unified the party, and brought more solidity to its control. And we see that evidence over the last 12, 13 years, obviously culminating when the two-term round for being president of the PRC was abolished, clearly showing that he intended to rule for as long as he desired and as long as he wanted. So I think he's in a strong position. Where there has been issues has been with the People's Liberation Army. And we've seen 2 rounds of major purges in the People's Liberation Army, which maybe makes him feel that he's not entirely comfortable with the way it's been organized. And remember, some of those people are ones that Xi Jinping himself appointed before he purged them. So his judgment hasn't always been precise and exact. He also has been concerned about corruption within the PLA and has moved those people out. He, of course, also removed his own choice as foreign minister. He's also most recently removed the head of the party's international liaison department. So clearly, there must be some people who are unsatisfied. There's some kind of frictions going on. But I think ultimately, as far as we know in the black box that is Chinese politics, he's pretty much in control and seems to be there for the at least near and if not medium-term future. I think a lot of us looking from outside misunderstood what was happening in China. I think we presumed that the liberalization was inevitable, that economic reforms would roll along and keep moving things ahead. And perhaps over a longer period of time, that might still prove to be true. But I think the one thing that we all underestimated was the core of the Communist Party, with its desire for control over much of society and as much of the economy as possible, never went away. And I think the crucial turning point really was way back, just after the turn of the century, that once the party was able to revive its funds, once it became more financially stable, it began to reassert itself and began to reassert control within the economy and elsewhere. And so I think when Xi Jinping took power, he looked around at what had been happening in the previous decade to 15 years, and I think he saw a mess. I think he saw corruption having risen. He saw frustrations within society. He saw local governments and society not following what the party wanted. And of course, he was always obsessed by what had happened to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. One of his very first speeches was the fact that nobody was man enough to stand up to the movements that were taking place. And he criticized the military also in the Soviet Union for not acting to defend the party sufficiently. And so I think he felt that if we want to keep driving China forward, it's got to be the party in control. And that means that you want a strong party, you want a unified party, you want to remove as many dissenting voices and diverse streams of opinion within the party as possible, and centralize not only therefore thinking, but also centralize as much control over the policy-making process as is feasible. And of course, that's why he got the nomenclature of the chairman of everything. I don't think he really is the chairman of everything. I mean, I don't think he has enough hours in the day to be chairman of everything. But certainly, I think with key factors, key policy, key direction, I think he's sort of exerted his authority. And he's certainly shown progressively since about 2013, not only is he going to crack down on corruption, but he's also going to eliminate views that he sees as being heretical and ensure that as far as possible, party members follow his view of what is correct policy. I think the biggest problem for me looking at the future is that there is no succession plan. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has never been good at replacing leaders. If I look back at the 100 years of the Communist Party, I can only think of one leadership transition that was relatively peaceful and not fraught by internal struggles. In fact, even if we think about when Xi Jinping took power, of course it followed a bitter internal debate which led to the removal of a potential rival, Bo Xilai. And so that wasn't an entirely peaceful transition of power. I think the problem is that because it now seems that Xi Jinping is there for good and going to be ruling over the system for as long as he desires, it creates the problem of what is a succession plan? What if he has a heart attack tomorrow? Who takes over? And I think really it's pushed that problem into a very uncertain future. And because the party's never been good, it doesn't have rules for succession, it makes the whole system very vulnerable. I think also creates a problem. If I was one of the next generation down in China in terms of age, I'd be pretty frustrated because, should have been my turn. And now basically I'm being told it's not. It's probably going to have to jump over a generation. So I think that group must be fairly frustrated by what they see as really their avenue to the top position now being shut off. So I suspect that behind the hidden doors of Zhongnan High, there's a lot of maneuvering going on. And I think many of us felt, when he brought in a standing committee of the Politburo that were all his people, they would all be yes men, there's no women there. But one begins to think that probably is not the case. One would think there's kind of jockeying going on, that people are maneuvering, people are sort of looking, wondering, are new alliances forming? And should he pass away unexpectedly, one might think that a lot more turmoil could break out within the party. And in fact, if one thinks about it historically, the only time the party's really been vulnerable is when there's been dissent within the elite. Well, the economy's been slowing for 10 years, and official figures say it's round about 5%. I don't think any outside observer really believes that. It's probably lower than the 5%. But it's not in crisis. People have talked about crisis in the economy. I mean, I think there's various causes that have been causing the slowdown. The cyclical causes, the kind of investment boom bust. There's been the sort of one-off impacts that came with things like COVID. But I think the fundamental problem is a structural problem. And that's where we might see problems over the longer term. That the model basically that has driven the Chinese economy, high levels of debt, concentration on infrastructure, exports, that model really is now producing declining returns. It's never going to produce the kind of levels of growth that it had before. And that really does put constraints about possibilities for the largesse of the government to be able to reward its followers and to be able to provide better benefits for its citizens. So that's a key problem, I think, within the economy. And it's not really making a shift to an effective new model. What does that mean? Well, we know that at the National People's Congress meeting this year, it again called for 5% growth. It also called that there would be 12.5 million new jobs created in urban China. But I think there's something like 17 million graduates coming out of the universities. So clearly the economy is not generating enough jobs to fulfill the ambitions of its younger generation. And when you think there's hundreds of millions of people in the gig economy, the inequalities are only going to increase, and that might lead to added frustrations. So there are, I think, risks there over time of possible instability, but I don't think there's any reason why one think of a collapse within the economy. The state still controls all the financial levers. It can print more money, it can put more stimulus funds in, so it can keep things going. But ultimately, that model of development, which since 2002, 2003, they say is outdated, they haven't been able to change. And now we have two other factors, I think, come in which are disturbing the process and having political consequences. One is the securitization of the economy, that for Xi Jinping, security has become dominant as a factor which begins to impact on the capabilities for economic growth. The other factor, I think, which has domestic and international political consequences is his focus on high quality growth. Why I say it has consequences is that domestically, it's not going to help resolve the challenge of inequality within China. It takes me back to the point about security. I mean, it's very much driven by Xi's demands for security within the economy to ward off threats from the West, dependence on the West. But it's really not offering anything to hundreds of millions of people who are either working in the countryside or are in the gig economy. They're not really going to benefit from that. So I think we're going to see an increasing inequality within China, which might lead to social stress over time. It's also going to produce external problems as well, because China is now overproducing, as we know, many of the green goods, many of the new technologies of the future. And with the involution in the economy, it can't absorb them domestically. So more and more of those are going to be exported. And that's going to create more trade frictions with other countries, not just in the United States or the European Union, but also within Southeast Asia and other countries around the world. If China could shift to a consumer-driven economy, that would be the natural path for it to take. 1.4 billion consumers, you would think that was a natural thing. And it would be, I think, the one way of keeping economic growth up at a reasonable level. They've talked about this now for 10, 15 years, but they've never been able to complete that transition. So that brings us to the fundamental question of why not? And it's really, I think, to do with state and party power. That if you shift more to a consumer-driven economy, you begin to shift power away from the state, away from the party, and put more power really into society. You have to sort of shift funds, you have to shift investment patterns. But it's quite clear that still, despite everything that they've talked about, the pragmatism that was perhaps shown at the last National People's Congress meeting, the emphasis is still heavily on an investment-led growth that favors the state-owned sector of the economy over the interests of the individual consumer. Now, state consumption is high, of course, but what I'm talking about is individual citizen consumption. And that has maybe gone up 1 to 2% over the last decade. But if you compare it to other countries around the world, it's very, very low. And I think that's really at core a set of political decisions that the party will not take that would enable it to unleash the consumer-driven economy. So despite all the talk about it, despite measures that were supposedly introduced to the National People's Congress, it shows that really it's on a back burner. And if the move to a consumer-driven economy is going to happen, it's going to be very incremental and eventually at a very slow pace could it move forward. Well, the party is always about maintaining political control, and social control and economic control. But I think it's not even, you might even argue in a way, it's not even a conscious movement. It's just that the political economy is now structured in such a way that benefits the state sector, those parts of the system where the party really has control and power, that breaking open that political economy becomes very difficult. I mean, Xi himself has talked about vested interests that are preventing kind of movement forward on significant reforms. And a number of sociologists, for example, at Tsinghua University, have written pretty decisively about the vested interest in the state sector, local government officials, real estate industry, etc., that really resist the kind of reforms that can shift the economic model onto a new basis. I think it's a complex picture, like all things in China. I mean, everything in China is actually much more complicated than we often realize from the outside. Ideology does play a role. I think there's no doubt about that Xi Jinping has stressed consistently that Marxism-Leninism is important. I mean, he has a very simplistic view of it, but he talks about historical materialism, and partly that justifies of why he thinks China is rising and the West is sort of falling. And he's instructed universities, he's instructed journalists that they have to study Marxism better to understand what the policies are moving forward. But I think at a real level, ideology sets a worldview, I think, for party officials that is very difficult for them to move outside of. And that does dictate certain policy choices. For example, you can't talk about privatization of the land because the land has to be collective for it to be socialist. So you can do a lot of things around the edges, but you can't really get to fundamental questions about property and property ownership because that's constrained by ideology. And I think it frames the kind of worldview and the lens through which party officials see the world externally and internally. And it provides constraints to their actions. Then if you add on to that, we've now had, since 1979, 1980, a whole set of reforms which have really put in place a new structure for the political economy, which, as I was saying earlier, has built certain vested interests. I mean, local government officials have interests, the people who run the state-owned banks have interests, the state-owned enterprises have certain interests, and you see that reflected through investment patterns, lending patterns, and just generally the way the economy and society operates. So that is very, very difficult to shift. I think even though, for example, the previous premier talked a lot about how market forces should play a dominant role, it's very tough under that situation to allow them to play the kind of role that the premier was talking about. Now, it's nonsense, of course, to say the market doesn't exist in China, because in many areas it doesn't. But if you look at the key levers and the key factors driving the economy, it's not really driven by the market. If you think about the way the economy is structured, I mean, 90% of new urban jobs are created by the non-state sector. It's now something like 60% of GDP, et cetera, et cetera. So the non-state sector plays a very, very important role. That's why I think over the last year or so, we've seen the re-emergence of the Premier Li Qiang talking more about the economy, and also Xi Jinping meeting in February with the private entrepreneurs to say, yes, there's a role for you, a new law coming in for the private sector. So there's a recognition that they have a role to play, and they don't want to frighten them off, because if they're going to supply the jobs for the people coming onto the job market, the state sector is not going to fulfill those obligations. That's got to be the non-state sector. So it does play an important role. But going back to the point that was being raised about the importance of the state sector, if you look at the real key factors driving industrial investment, driving now a lot of the investment in what Xi Jinping talks about in terms of high quality development, he really, I think, turns more towards the state sector as driving that, or a private sector which is really going to be at the beck and call of the party to fulfill its wishes. There's no doubt there's a lot of frustration within the system, because many of those who are in kind of middle levels in the system are products of the Deng Xiaoping era. And many of them are very frustrated that they think the progress in reform that was made in those years, despite what the side effects and problems may have been, have really been rolled back. And in many ways, Xi Jinping has broken all the kind of informal norms that were set up during the Deng Xiaoping era. And I think that has frustrated a lot of people. Many local government officials, of course, are pretty much paralyzed. Why do something when it might be wrong? It's better just to do nothing. And I think that's a pretty common refrain. And it's a common refrain because there's even been articles in the People's Daily saying, oh, it's nonsense that the local government officials aren't doing anything. Well, of course, that means, of course, they're not doing anything. And the questions of where it's very difficult to say whether that leads to real instability or not. A lot of academics are frustrated as well. They feel that there's been a pushback in terms of what they could and couldn't do in terms of teaching and research at the universities. The question around the youth unemployment, which we mentioned earlier, I think that is more important if it begins to impact on the middle class and the middle class get frustrated. I think there's a lot of mechanisms for control in place, digital monitoring of citizens, the party inserting itself into more and more into social organizations, the social work department that was set up to oversee and insert sort of party loyalty into non-state institutions. So I think the party's seen the risk of control slipping away and is trying hard to reinsert itself into as much of society as is possible. So at the moment, it seems to be fairly well in control. Local government debt is without doubt a massive problem. It's been rolled over a number of times, and ultimately what it's leading to is it can't invest as much as it did before. Salaries aren't being paid. A lot of frustration with local government officials. So yes, there's a lot of frustration out there. And I think the honest answer is we have no idea. No one expected 1989 to break out the way it did. An unexpected event, the death of Hu Yaobang, sparked a whole set of responses, not just from the students, but there was frustration amongst the urban population, there was frustration with the rural population, there was certainly frustration with intellectuals who felt that much of what they'd been doing was being curtailed and rolled back. So it's hard to say, and you can never say no. And if there's an unexpected incident that's set a spark, you might see those points of frustration coming together. But I think the point there is there's no real clear point of cohesion around a different vision of what a way forward might be or what an alternative might be. And what you might see as a result is just a kind of realignment and a reshuffling within the party elite to try and accommodate some of these frustrations, and maybe a shift back to where China was under Jiang Zemin, still control, but a more relaxed atmosphere in many ways, allowing local officials to sort of make money while they're sort of doing their jobs. Maybe even going back to some of the ideas that Zhao Ziyang had put forward at Deng Xiaoping's bidding in the 1980s, which then were, of course, abandoned after the demonstrations of 1989. So I think with China, you can never rule anything out. Who knew the uprising in Wuchang was going to lead to the end of the empire?